She was forced to marry her cousin at 12. She gave birth to 12 children. 4 died before she could stop bleeding. The court called her a queen, but history called her nothing. She spent her final years whispering the names of her dead, refusing light, mirrors, and memory. Maria Isabella didn't die of illness. She died of grief, quietly and completely alone. She was born into a world that was already crumbling. On July 6, 1789, as the streets of Paris trembled with the first cries of revolution, a girl was born in the palatial calm of Madrid. Her name was Maria Isabel de Borbón y Borbón Parma, and her fate was stitched not in freedom, but in blood. She never chose her parents. She never chose her future. Her father was King Charles IV of Spain, a man who ruled without truly reigning, a monarch overshadowed by his wife and his ministers. Her mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, was ambitious, controlling, and deeply entangled in palace politics. Together, they gave the child a birthright wrapped in silk and silence. They also gave her a body marked by centuries of bloodline tightening. Maria Isabella was born from a lineage that didn't branch. It curled back onto itself. The Bourbons had married their cousins for 4 generations before her, and the inheritance was not only titles, it was deformities. From infancy, her nurses whispered about the girl's strange proportions. Her face, they said, was long, not striking, not ugly, just wrong. Her jaw slanted ever so slightly to the left, making her smile appear lopsided. One cheekbone stood higher than the other, and in certain candlelight, her reflection seemed like 2 halves of different girls. She had the Bourbon mouth, a lower lip fuller than expected, giving her a perpetual pout that court painters tried to soften. But the most haunting feature was her eyes. As a child, they were deep and quiet, eyes that watched more than they spoke. As she grew older, those eyes never quite aligned. One seemed to drift, ever so subtly, toward the past. She was raised inside El Escorial, the royal monastery palace where Catholic grandeur met cold marble discipline. She was educated in prayers, manners, needlework, and silence. No music unless approved, no opinions unless asked. Her toys were miniature thrones and porcelain babies. Her future was written in contracts and treaties before she ever learned to write her name in ink. While Spain trembled outside its borders, with war, rebellion, and whispers of Napoleon, Maria Isabella was kept inside like a porcelain figure. A girl bred not for love, not for thought, but for breeding. There were no birthday celebrations, no childhood friends. She had a governess who called her Majestad, even when brushing her hair, and tutors who reminded her, gently, that a royal girl did not ask too many questions. She learned early that her body was not hers. It belonged to Spain, to Bourbon, to duty. At 9, she was paraded before ambassadors as a promising match. At 10, discussions began about a cousin in Naples. At 11, her portrait was sent across the sea, evaluated like livestock, then accepted. At 12, she was promised. At 13, she was shipped away. But even before her wedding, the kingdom had already taken her voice. She was not permitted to object. She was not encouraged to feel. She was simply assigned. The decision had nothing to do with her wishes, her readiness, her dreams. It had everything to do with the map. Spain needed Naples. The Bourbons needed to keep their power consolidated in the Italian peninsula. Her husband-to-be, Francis, Crown Prince of the 2 Sicilies, was not only her cousin, he was a tool of survival for a crumbling dynasty. Maria Isabella's mother called it an honor. The priests called it God's will. The ministers called it diplomacy. Only the child herself called it what it was, an execution dressed as matrimony. She left Madrid under a veil, escorted by guards, priests, and bureaucrats. Her trousseau included gowns she would grow into, and a rosary her mother told her never to lose. It was made of silver and gilt, passed down from a grandmother who had also been married too young. No one asked what she wanted. No one cared if she was ready. The ship to Naples was cold, and the sea was unkind. She grew sick crossing the Mediterranean, trembling in her white gloves, clinging to the rosary like a lifeline. Somewhere along that journey, the girl began to disappear. In her place stood a queen in training, learning not to cry even when seasick, learning to smile when she wanted to scream. By the time she reached Portici Palace, the laughter had left her completely. The Neapolitan court received her with applause, and the marriage was celebrated with fireworks, choirs, and public displays of loyalty. But behind the embroidered curtains, a child stood alone in a wedding gown, waiting to be claimed by a man she barely knew. Francis was 10 years older, reserved, stern, emotionally distant. He had little interest in his bride beyond her role. That night, Maria Isabella stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the plaster. The bed was too large, the room too silent. The rosary dug into her hand, but she did not let go. She had crossed from childhood to queenship in a matter of days. There was no applause in her heart, only silence, vast, aching, and absolute. The marble corridor was too long for a girl that small. 12 years old, draped in a white silk gown that trailed behind her like the train of a bride twice her size. On her head, a veil fastened by pins that pulled too tightly at her scalp. In her hands, a silver rosary, its beads cold, unfamiliar, too heavy. Her steps echoed off the columns as she was led toward the altar by women who whispered prayers but didn't meet her eyes. No one asked if she was afraid. No one asked if she understood. Francis, her husband-to-be, stood at the far end of the aisle. Crown Prince of the two Sicilies, her first cousin by blood, and soon her husband by contract. He was 23, stern, watchful. He wore a sword but not a smile. His eyes, fixed on the girl approaching, revealed nothing. Not disgust, not desire, not warmth, just duty. They had met once before, briefly, when she was still a child clutching a handkerchief and he was a prince discussing war with her father. Now, she would share his bed, share his life, bear his children. But they would never share love. That was not part of the arrangement. The ceremony was short, efficient, lavish in appearance, but hollow in feeling. Incense swirled in the air. Latin chants blurred into white noise. The crown was placed, the rings exchanged, and the girl with the two big eyes became Regina delle Due Sicilie, Queen of the two Sicilies in name, in law, in chains. Later that night, the celebrations outside the palace were deafening. Fireworks burst over Naples. Bells rang from towers. Courtiers toasted. Musicians played until their fingers bled. But in a darkened room within the palace, Maria Isabella sat on the edge of a canopy bed, still in her wedding dress, staring at her own hands. The veil had been removed, the jewelry set aside. Her hair, once curled meticulously by maids, had begun to unravel. A single strand clung to her cheek, like a question. She was 12. He was a man. The door was locked from the inside. What happened that night would never be written down. The royal archives are silent. No memoir, no letter, no confession. But the silence itself speaks. She was not a wife. She was a vessel. The following days passed in ceremonial blur. Audiences, greetings, receptions, introductions to nobles who smiled through clenched teeth and addressed her as Your Majesty, though none truly saw her. She sat beside Francis at court, behind Francis at Mass, beneath Francis in every decision. She was expected to smile. She was expected to obey. She was expected to begin the work of producing heirs. Behind closed doors, Francis was civil, distant, cold. He treated her with the same decorum one might afford a fragile diplomatic gift, precious, breakable, untouchable in spirit. There was no cruelty, but there was no intimacy either. He fulfilled his duty, and then he left the room. Maria Isabella learned not to flinch. She learned not to cry. She learned to exist in fragments. Part princess, part child, part ghost. The palace in Naples was larger than El Escorial, but lonelier. Its walls were gilded and warm, yet they muffled her voice in the same way. She was now in Italy, but nothing felt different. The meals were richer, the dresses heavier, the expectations harsher. She began to bleed soon after the wedding, a detail her ladies-in-waiting reported with hushed approval. The queen was becoming a woman. It was time to begin the work. They gave her herbal tonics, strict diets, daily instructions on posture, sleep, and touch. Everything was timed. Everything was watched. Everything was calculated. At night she slept with her hands on her stomach, as if willing life to begin inside her. During the day, she was paraded through gardens and courts, told to wave, told to smile, told to represent fertility and prosperity. But inside, she felt hollow. A bell without a clapper, a seed planted in winter. There were moments when her mask cracked. Once a chambermaid found her seated alone before a mirror, tracing her fingers along her jawline, whispering, "Do I look like them?" She meant her mother, her cousin husband, her ancestors, whose portraits lined the walls like judges. Another time, during Mass, she fainted. Some said it was the heat. Others blamed the corset. No one considered that it might be sorrow. Her letters to Madrid, if they survived, remain hidden in the archives. But one account from a Spanish noblewoman mentions her writing. "I feel the marble in my blood now. It is cold and without song." Pregnancy came before her 14th birthday. The palace rejoiced. Ministers declared it a sign of divine favor. Francis nodded in solemn approval. A boy was expected. A Bourbon heir. A future king. She was given more tutors, not for herself, but to prepare for raising princes. She was assigned midwives, herbalists, confessor priests. She was watched more closely than ever. Every appetite noted, every tremor recorded. The birth was difficult. The child, a son, lived only months. They buried him in velvet. She was not permitted to attend. The court moved on quickly. The bells rang not for mourning, but for the queen's recovery. She was young, they said. She would try again, and again, and again. But something had shifted. Not in her body, in her eyes. She no longer looked straight ahead. She had begun to stare through people, past them, beyond them, into some place only she could see. They called her strong, but what they meant was silent. Her body was never hers again. From the moment she bled at 13, she became property, not of one man, but of a dynasty. The Bourbon bloodline, the House of Naples, the empire of cousins and contracts. They had taken her name, they had taken her youth, and now they took her womb. She was still learning to write her letters in Italian when the midwives began charting her cycles. Still startled by the way her breasts ached in the morning when they told her to lie flat and count the days. Still a child when the court whispered of kings yet unborn, waiting inside her like promises. The first pregnancy came quickly. The child, a boy, was born weak, pale, almost translucent. He gasped once, then again, then never again. They named him Luigi, wrapped him in crimson velvet, and placed him in a casket small enough to rest in her lap. She never got to hold him. The nurses took him first. The priests blessed him next. The doctors nodded in silence. The queen, they said, must rest. The body must heal. There would be more. And so she was fed soups with deer marrow, bathed in rosemary and salt, forced to walk the gardens for air. She passed the statue of the Virgin daily, pausing to stare not at the face of Mary, but at the child in her arms. No one asked if she mourned. They only asked when she would try again. She tried, again and again and again. 12 children in total. Some lived, some didn't. All left their mark on her. Physically, emotionally, eternally. Her hips widened. Her spine curved. Her skin bore stretch marks that looked like cracking marble. And her silence deepened with each birth. The second child survived. A daughter named Maria Cristina. Bright-eyed, delicate, thoughtful. A girl who, for a time, gave Maria Isabella a reason to smile behind closed doors. She would brush her hair herself, kiss her forehead before sleep, whisper lullabies in broken Neapolitan. But the smiles never lasted long. The third child, another daughter, was born in the winter. The labor was long. The blood was heavy. The baby cried, then coughed, then wheezed. By her third birthday, she was coughing blood onto silk sheets. They said it was the air. They said it was the climate. They never said the truth, that the dynasty's blood was thinning, softening, unraveling. The girl died in her mother's arms, while the rest of the court dined 2 floors below. Maria Isabella did not speak for 3 days. On the 4th, she wrote her daughter's name in the condensation of a window, then watched it fade. Still, the ministers pressed on. Still, the priests assured her. Still, her husband came to her chamber when summoned by expectation. She birthed Francesco in 1822, the future king. A boy with Bourbon features and the gaze of a frightened animal. The court called him a miracle. The physicians noted his nervous tics. Maria Isabella noted the way he stared at corners and repeated prayers twice. But he was alive. That was enough. For the state, not for the mother. By then, Maria Isabella had stopped believing that life equaled peace. Each child came into the world through pain, and she learned to anticipate not laughter, but funeral bells. Maria Amalia, plagued by tremors and sleeplessness since childhood. Maria Luisa, born silent, buried before dawn. Maria Antonia, unable to speak full sentences until age 10, often retreating into fits of quiet, strange gestures. And Maria Cristina, her brightest, her favorite, lost to lung disease before marriage. Each child left a room behind, and Maria Isabella kept them all intact. She would walk through them at night, one by one, pulling back the sheets, adjusting pillows, folding clothes too small for any living child, speaking to the silence like it could speak back. In private, she wept. In public, she smiled. The queen had done her duty, they said. She had filled the palace with life, but no one counted the dead. No one saw the girl behind the veil, behind the title, behind the blood-soaked linen in the dark. She aged quickly, not in years, but in weight, in posture, in eyes that grew heavier each time they reopened after labor. Her hands trembled when she held rosaries now, not because of fear, but because they reminded her of cribs and coffins. The physicians wrote reports. Her Majesty grows fatigued easily, prone to melancholia. The priests offered more prayers. The midwives prepared for another cycle. But Maria Isabella had begun to disappear from herself. She walked slower. She spoke softer. She often paused mid-sentence, as if chasing a thought she no longer wished to finish. She stood at the nursery door and stared at empty cradles as though expecting an apology. There was no statue erected for the babies she lost. No day of mourning, no name etched into palace marble. Their deaths were seen as minor disruptions, footnotes in the machinery of monarchy. Only Maria Isabella remembered every one, the weight, the smell, the sound of that first tiny gasp, the last smaller one that followed hours later. By the time she was 30, she had endured more births than birthdays, more farewells than anniversaries. She had given everything her body could offer, and still the court called her lucky. She was queen. She had heirs. She was blessed. But she was breaking. Not visibly, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention. No. She was breaking in the quietest way a woman can, from the inside, from a place between the ribs and the soul, from the absence that no crown could ever fill. She had done what was asked of her. A son was born, a future king. The bloodline was secured. The kingdom rejoiced. The bells rang not for the mother, but for the continuity of power. Maria Isabella, now in her early 30s, was no longer a wife in the eyes of the court. She had become a vessel fulfilled, a body with nothing more to offer. The queen had delivered. Now she could be dismissed. Francis, once distant, grew absent. His visits to her chamber ceased altogether. He spoke to her through envoys, advisors, and servants. He responded to her letters with polite formalities, one-sentence notes signed with indifference. In public, he stood beside her like a statue. In private, he lived as though she did not exist. She was not betrayed. She was not mistreated. She was simply ignored, which was its own cruelty. What is worse than being hurt is being rendered invisible. She remained in her wing of the palace, the quiet side, the decorative half of royalty, still invited to banquets, but seated farther away, still called Majesty, but with a courtesy that rang hollow. Her voice, once soft but heard, began to fade altogether. When she spoke, people smiled, but did not listen. When she requested, they nodded, but did not act. When she questioned, they deflected. Because what could a mother of an heir possibly need? She was not part of the council, not summoned for discussion, not consulted, even in matters of her own children. She lived in embroidered silence, surrounded by gilded frames, perfumed halls, and marble floors that echoed her steps but never led her anywhere real. They had praised her fertility, but they had no use for her mind. She tried to involve herself in charitable work, but her proposals were left unread. She asked for more books in Spanish. The request was forgotten. She offered to help tutor her daughters. The tutors declined. It was not hostility. It was not punishment. It was something colder, irrelevance. Once she attempted to speak at court about a dispute between two nobles. The room went quiet. Frances looked at her, not with anger, but with confusion, as though a painting had spoken. After that, she said less. She spent more time in the gardens, walking alone, reading psalms out loud to no one in particular, watching the fountain water dance in loops like time itself, repetitive, enclosed, and directionless. Even the portraits began to change. The royal artists no longer requested her sitting. Her face no longer appeared in official commissions. The new murals depicted Francis and their son, surrounded by olive branches, oracles, and Roman eagles, symbols of strength, future, eternity. Maria Isabella was not included, not even as background. When her ladies-in-waiting asked if she noticed, she smiled. But her eyes dropped, as if remembering something distant. She simply said, "It is easier that way." She was the queen of the two Sicilies, but her crown sat in a velvet box, unopened for years. She wore no jewelry but a rosary. She held no power but memory. Inside the palace, her chambers became a private museum of loss. She kept the clothes of her dead children in pressed wooden drawers, folded so carefully that no crease could offend their memory. She arranged their toys, untouched, on a mantel as if they might return. She kept their names alive in whispered prayers, in gentle caresses of stone busts, in quiet conversations with empty rooms. Her son, Francesco, now a boy of 6 or 7, saw his mother less often. He was raised by court tutors, military advisors, and priests. He was molded into a monarch, not loved as a child. Maria Isabella watched from windows as he practiced swordplay, recited state doctrine, bowed before elders he didn't know. She tried once to embrace him in the corridor. He stood stiff, unsure. A guard cleared his throat, and the moment passed. She did not cry. She simply turned back to her room, adjusted the lace on a bassinet, no longer in use, and lit a candle for her daughter who died coughing in the night. The whispers started, soft but cruel, that she was melancholic, that she was no longer composed, that her hands trembled more, that her walk had slowed, that she talked too much to herself and too little to others. One duchess, in a private letter, wrote, "The queen is well-dressed, well-fed, and well-forgotten. She lives among shadows and lullabies. It is perhaps a quiet madness." But she was not mad. She was unheard. There is a violence in silencing someone who was once a voice. A pain in watching the world continue without needing you, without acknowledging that your blood made it possible. She had borne the weight of crowns in her womb. She had endured labor 12 times. She had lost 4 children, and still, her name was fading like dust on a velvet cushion. Sometimes she stood in front of the mirror, trying to see what they saw, perhaps what they didn't. The eyes were duller, the posture more resigned, the skin thinner. But the woman inside still remembered being 12, holding a rosary, staring at a stranger she would call husband. That child never left. She only got quieter. Francis never mistreated her, but he never touched her again. He took mistresses in secret, courted allies in daylight, smiled for portraits alone. When guests inquired about the queen, he'd say, "She prefers privacy," and nothing more. By 40, Maria Isabella's voice was gone from court entirely. By 45, she had stopped attending public ceremonies. By 50, most Neapolitans could not recall her face. She lived inside the palace. She moved through the halls. But her presence had become ghost-like, visible but untouched. Real but unreal. She had brought forth a king, and in doing so, had exiled herself. There was no single moment when Maria Isabella collapsed. No shattering scream, no fit of madness, no spectacle. Her unraveling was slow, quiet, stretched thin across years, like silk left in the rain, fading, loosening, dissolving into something no longer whole, yet still painfully present. She stopped eating meals with others. She took them alone, in silence, sometimes not at all. Her attendants would find trays untouched, soup gone cold, bread unbroken. Some days, she would sit at her writing desk for hours and never lift a pen. Other days, she would stare at her own reflection, as if searching for someone she had once been and now could no longer recognize, or perhaps had never known. Her voice grew softer, not weak, but distant, as though each word had to travel through layers of fog before reaching her lips. She spoke less to people and more to objects. Portraits, rosaries, empty cradles, she whispered to the names embroidered on burial cloths. She murmured lullabies in hallways no longer filled with children's feet. Grief did not strike her like thunder. It settled like dusk. It wrapped itself around her bones and sank into her breath. It became a second skin. From 1836, the year her beloved daughter, Maria Cristina, died coughing blood onto her nightgown, she began to vanish from public life entirely. The girl had been her only light, her confidant, the one child who seemed to truly see her not as majesty, but as mother. When Maria Cristina's eyes dimmed, something in the Queen's gaze dulled permanently. After the funeral, held with all the ceremony demanded by royal protocol, Maria Isabella returned to her chambers and locked the door. She allowed no visitors for 2 days. When she emerged, she had braided her own hair. She wore no jewels. Her eyes were rimmed red, but dry. She walked as though she were made of glass. That night, she ordered her attendants to remove all mirrors from her rooms. She claimed it was superstition. The truth was harder to name. She could not bear to see the face that had given birth to so many, only to watch them leave her. She had come to believe her womb had been cursed, not by God, but by the bloodline she had been forced to serve. Each child, conceived not in love but in obligation, had felt like a coin paid to fate. Some were accepted, others taken back. She began to sleep less. There were reports of candlelight flickering beneath her door at all hours. Maids spoke of strange sounds, a rustle, a prayer, the soft hum of a woman singing alone. A few said they heard laughter, but it was a child's laughter, and no children lived on that side of the palace anymore. The doctors called it melancholia. The priests called it penance. But no one called it what it was, an ordinary, unglamorous, devastating grief. She had not lost her mind. She had lost too much of her heart. Sometimes, when the corridors were empty and the marble didn't echo so cruelly, she would descend to the royal crypt at Santa Chiara, where 4 of her children lay in tiny sarcophagi beneath the stone. She would kneel beside them, whisper to each by name, and place a small item on each tomb. A ribbon, a button, a dried flower. She never stayed long. She never cried there. The tears, by then, had become internal. They did not fall. They sank. By the early 1840s, she had ceased to appear at public events entirely. No baptisms, no weddings, not even her son's ceremonies. She wrote letters of congratulation when required. She signed them as the Queen Mother, though no one referred to her that way anymore. The court had moved on. The country, too. Francis died. A new queen was crowned. Maria Isabella was now just a figure, one kept out of view, out of mind. A living shadow. A relic of an earlier, sadder chapter. She did not fight this erasure. She welcomed it. To be forgotten meant she no longer had to perform, no longer had to smile, no longer had to explain the tremor in her hand or the wetness in her eyes when someone mentioned a name she had not spoken aloud in years. In her final years, her rooms grew darker, even during the day. Heavy drapes were drawn across the windows. The scent of lavender and beeswax filled the air. There were fewer servants, fewer visitors, fewer distractions. She surrounded herself with memory and silence, the two things that never lied to her. When she did speak, it was soft, fragmented, and always about the past. She liked oranges, she once told a maid, out of nowhere. Maria Cristina. I used to peel them for her myself. Or, Luigi had very small hands, too small. I thought he would grow, but he didn't. Or, I hear them sometimes, laughing. It's very soft, but I know it's them. There were no tantrums, no screams, no outbursts. Just a slow, heavy decline into solitude. In 1846, she stopped walking altogether. She said her legs no longer listened to her. Doctors claimed it was a combination of age and nerves. Privately, her attendants believed she simply had no reason left to stand. She requested that a small altar be placed in her room, not for show, but for conversation. She began to pray out loud, not in Latin, but in Spanish. Her native tongue, the one she had used as a child before being taken from her home, from her name, from herself. When she was lucid, she asked for simple things: warm cloths, rose water, old music. When she was not, she called out for her children, always by name, always in the same order, always with the same tenderness, as though summoning them home for supper. The staff began to avoid her chambers unless necessary, not out of cruelty, out of guilt. They did not know how to serve a woman who asked only to remember. They did not know how to help someone who wanted nothing but to be near the dead. She was dying, but slowly, like a candle burning with just enough wax to keep from flickering out. There was no diagnosis, no final illness, just a quiet unmaking. In September of 1848, she asked to be left alone for the evening. She said she wanted to sleep. Her hands were folded over her chest. Her breath was shallow but steady. By morning, she was gone. No public announcement, no royal funeral. By her own request, she was buried not in the royal vault beside kings and queens, but near the tombs of the children she had buried long before. Her last wish was simple. Do not let them remember my face, only my silence. When a queen dies without legacy, the world rarely pauses. There were no bells across Naples the morning her death was confirmed. No public announcement declared the loss of Maria Isabella di Borbone Spagna. No parade of priests, no ceremonial mass, no long line of nobles in black. Only a few discreet letters passed between officials, noting her burial near her children as requested, and the date on which her rooms were to be cleared. The palace, ever efficient in its cold machinery, wasted no time returning her chambers to neutrality. Portraits were removed, drapes were cleaned, rosaries were boxed and stacked in storage beneath the chapel. A few surviving garments were sent to be reused by lesser nobles. The cradles and toys, those sacred relics of her private world, were quietly burned, not out of cruelty, not out of haste, but out of the simple, brutal practicality of a court that had long since moved on from her. Within a month, her name had vanished from official conversation. Within a season, her memory existed only in the minds of maids too afraid to speak it. Her son, King Ferdinand II, made no public tribute. Not even a letter to the kingdom, not even a moment of silence at court. She was, technically, his mother. She had carried him through pain, nursed him despite exhaustion, prayed for him while burying his siblings, and suffered alone for the sake of his survival. But to him, she was simply the woman who had fulfilled her obligation. She had given life. And after that, she was given space. He did not visit her grave. She had asked to be buried beside her lost children, not in marble splendor, not beneath an arch of saints or kings, but in the shadows of those she had loved most fiercely and lost most completely. And there, under the stones of Santa Chiara, she was laid to rest. No inscription marked her grief. No angels bore her face. Her successor, the woman who would fill her place at Francis's side after his death, was another cousin, younger and fresher, still capable of bearing heirs if required. She wore brighter gowns. She smiled at public events. She spoke often and laughed freely. And, most importantly to the court, she spoke when spoken to. The paintings resumed. The artists returned. New queens needed new portraits, new alliances, new symbols of hope and order. Maria Isabella was nowhere to be seen in these images. Even in family murals, her presence was quietly erased. The children who survived her were drawn standing beside fathers, brothers, or tutors, never her. When historians of the Bourbon dynasty compiled genealogies, she became a passing line. First wife of Francis III, mother to Ferdinand II, 12 children, died 1848. No mention of her grief. No mention of her fading. No mention of the silence that had consumed her. The palace that once rang with her footsteps, young and eager, now housed others. Women who had not known the velvet weight of 6 stillbirths. Girls who had not knelt over cradles with blue lips. Mothers who had not spent decades whispering names into the dark. She was replaced not just in role, but in memory. Even the servants, most of whom were rotated or retired, no longer carried her stories. Some remembered a quiet queen, or the one who stayed in her rooms, or the woman with the sad eyes. But those fragments drifted into myth faster than any monument could be built. And no monument ever was. There was no marble effigy, no chapel dedicated in her name, no holiday bearing her likeness, no opera written to mourn her, no poem slipped under pews by grieving hands, no lullaby hummed by nurses bearing the same name. She had lived a life of service to power, and when her service ended, so did the need to remember. Perhaps that was how she wanted it. She had stopped sitting for portraits in her final years. She had asked not to be painted in decay. She had whispered to her attendants that she did not wish to be remembered with that face, and so she wasn't. The only surviving image from her later years is a verbal one, a diplomat's journal entry from 1842. The Queen's eyes do not meet. One stares forward. The other, I believe, has not stopped looking backward. It is a haunting description, but perhaps it is the most accurate record of who she became, a woman who could no longer look at the world as it was, because too much of her had died in the world as it had been. She was replaced in stages, first by younger queens, then by more obedient ones, later by names more useful to history, wives of kings who expanded borders, mothers of emperors who reshaped Europe. Maria Isabella had no empire of her own, only a lineage that decayed behind her, and a sorrow that was too quiet to echo. No one wrote her biography. No dramatist claimed her tragedy. No historian elevated her into a symbol. She did not go mad. She did not wage war. She did not rule. And so, she was not remembered. Because history often prefers its women loud, beautiful, victorious, or scandalous. It has no place, no patience, for grief without spectacle, for silence without drama, for pain without triumph. And yet, in the stillness of Naples, if you walk through the cloisters of Santa Chiara, past the tombs of princes and saints, down into the quieter corners where names begin to vanish from stone, you might find a simple marker. No crown, no portrait. Just one name, faded. Maria Isabella. She was a queen. She was a mother. She was a girl who bled for an empire and was buried in its forgetfulness. And though the world did not mourn her, her absence lingers in the corridors she once walked, in the echo of a woman who gave everything and was left with nothing but her grief. The price of keeping the bloodline pure was not paid in gold, nor in land, nor in loyalty. It was paid in broken minds, trembling hands, twisted jaws, and children who stared into space as if they had come into the world already tired of it. Maria Isabella's 12 children were born not just of flesh, but of calculation, outcomes of a political experiment carried out across generations, fueled by cousin marriages and royal paranoia. A desperate attempt to preserve control by folding the family tree inward until it became a noose. Each child came into the world already carrying centuries of repetition. Their veins bore not just blood, but memory, of uncles who were also grandfathers, of aunts who were also cousins, of monarchs who had married nieces in the name of God and continuity. Her eldest surviving son, Ferdinand II, the heir for whom she had suffered, cried for, and bled, became king in name, but never in peace. He was raised in marble corridors by men who valued obedience more than warmth. And he emerged from childhood with a sharp temper, obsessive habits, and a profound mistrust of affection. He kept his chambers locked at night, washed his hands until the skin peeled, insisted that curtains be drawn at precisely the same time each evening, and was known to fly into rages over the smallest deviations in routine. Some called it eccentricity. Some whispered the word nervoso, others tormentato. But those who had seen Maria Isabella walking the same corridors in her final years, pacing between portraits, smoothing invisible wrinkles in garments no longer worn, might have recognized the pattern. Madness does not always scream. Sometimes it repeats, quietly, faithfully, generation after generation. Maria Amalia, another daughter, was said to have developed uncontrollable seizures as a teenager, falling to the floor with trembling limbs during dinners, shaking violently in bed for hours at a time, then waking confused and ashamed. She was hidden from court functions, attended by physicians who prescribed baths, leeches, and prayer. But her condition never truly improved. She spoke in short, clipped phrases, rarely looked others in the eye, and spent much of her adult life drifting between depressive spells and moments of eerie, frozen silence. Maria Antonia, born just after a difficult winter, struggled with language from infancy. She did not speak until she was nearly 7, and even then her sentences were fragmented, repetitive, whispered as if uttered through water. Her tutors documented her unusual behavior in polite euphemisms. Delayed development, inattentive, of fragile temperament. But the servants, less restrained by protocol, told stories of her laughing alone in the nursery, rocking back and forth with her fingers in her ears, unable to stop humming lullabies she had never been taught. Maria Luisa, one of the youngest, never breathed more than a few hours outside the womb. She was born too early, too blue, too quiet. Her mother, still bleeding, asked to hold her. The doctors refused. And the child that bore the dynasty forward, Francesco, the future king, the reason Maria Isabella was ever married in the first place, showed signs from a very young age of an internal war no tutor could discipline away. He was intelligent, yes, and sharp in matters of state. But he was also deeply anxious, prone to obsessive thought loops, rigid in ritual, and haunted by fears he could not explain. He insisted that meals be arranged symmetrically, that prayers be repeated precisely 3 times, that his slippers face the same direction each night, and if interrupted, he would begin again, not out of superstition, but out of compulsion. He feared contamination, he feared illness, he feared death, and perhaps somewhere buried deep inside his bones, he feared inheritance. These were not isolated cases. They were symptoms. The Bourbon dynasty, from France to Spain to Naples, had been breeding within itself for centuries. The lines between consort and cousin, between queen and niece, had long since blurred. Marriages were arranged not for love, not even for alliance, but for blood, to preserve it, to keep it recognizable, to avoid the contamination of foreign lineage. And the result was a family line that looped instead of branched. A pedigree so tightly wound that the same names repeated like echoes. Carlos, Maria, Ferdinand, Isabella. Carlos again, Maria again, each bearing not just a name, but a face, a chin, a jaw, a genetic mirror of those who had come before, and often the same invisible cracks. Prognathism, the jaw deformity passed down through the Habsburgs and Bourbons alike, became not just a symbol of royalty, but of genetic exhaustion. Neurological tics, emotional dysregulation, depression, obsessive behaviors, these too became familiar. It was not divine punishment. It was biology, misunderstood and misused by empires too obsessed with purity to notice the damage being replicated in flesh and mind. Maria Isabella had not understood these things. She had not studied heredity. She had not read theories of degeneration, but she had lived with it. She had birthed it. She had watched it unfold in the bodies and minds of the people she loved most. And perhaps, in her quietest moments, she had wondered whether her grief was not just grief, but recognition. Recognition that the empire she had been forced to build in her womb was already cracked before it ever began. The doctors of her time could not explain it. The priests blamed demons or sin. The tutors blamed weak wills or poor discipline. But Maria Isabella knew, even if she never said it aloud, that something had been passed down to her children that prayers could not purify, that discipline could not straighten, that no royal title could conceal. She had loved them all, even the ones who died too early to form words, even the ones who frightened her with the strangeness in their eyes. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of all. To love what you have been told is holy, while watching it fall apart from the inside. History has a way of cleaning its mirrors, polishing the faces it wants to remember, and allowing the rest to blur beneath the dust of disinterest. Maria Isabella of Spain was not disgraced. She was not overthrown. She committed no crime. And yet, she was removed from memory with a precision that only monarchies, with their archives and their silences, could master. There were no statues raised in her name. No streets bore her title. No ballads mourned her fate. No cathedral windows held her image in glass. She left behind no memoirs, no handwritten testament to her suffering, no philosophical reflections scribbled in the margins of state documents. What remained were records, clinical, brief, bloodless. Birth dates, death notices, a name in a baptism registry, mentions in royal gazettes as a vessel, a consort, a producer of kings. The royal biographers who chronicled the age of Francis I and Ferdinand II gave her little more than a line, and even that line was footnoted, positioned beneath her husband's military victories and her son's coronation oaths. She was described not by her thoughts, but by her function. She was mother. She was wife. She was first queen. And after that, no one. The Bourbon archives, heavy with letters between ministers and monarchs, offer only glancing references to her existence. Correspondence about her dowry, updates on her pregnancies, a few notes on her melancholy, phrased in the stiff, detached language of male secretaries, who saw her not as a human being, but as a logistical concern to be managed. Even portraits of her were few. Most were commissioned early in her marriage, before the births, before the deaths, before the grief had set into her posture and etched itself into the lines beside her eyes. They show a young woman with aristocratic features, draped in lace and pearls, staring somewhere off the edge of the canvas. She is regal. She is still. She is empty. There are no paintings from her later years. She refused them. Refused to sit for the brush after age 47. Refused to let her fading body become another object of court display. In a letter preserved in the House of Naples archive, unsigned but widely believed to be hers, the handwriting trembles as it says, "Do not remember me as I have become. That face does not belong to me." And so they didn't. They remembered her not at all. In official royal genealogies published decades later, her presence is summarized in the cold symmetry of lineage. Francis I, married. 1. Maria Isabella of Spain, 12 children, married 2. No mention that she was married at 12. No mention that 4 of her children died in infancy. No mention that 3 others lived with disorders so visible the court hid them from foreign dignitaries. No mention that she had retreated into silence, not because she lacked thought, but because the palace no longer permitted her to speak it. She had become, in death, what they had demanded of her in life: compliant, unresisting, perfectly quiet. No queen's funeral, no state mourning, no funeral procession through Naples, no masses sung in multiple cities, as was customary. She had asked for none, but even so, the world did not ask why she asked to disappear. Her tomb, if visited today, lies not beneath a triumphal arch nor a royal vault, but among the simpler stones, near the crypts of her children, near the forgotten. No crown decorates the carving. No inscription extols her virtue or her sorrow. It reads simply, Maria Isabella. Not even her full title, not queen, not of Naples, not of Spain, just a name, barely protected from the weather. The school books written for noble children in Naples in the mid-19th century referred to her only in passing, if at all. She was taught as an example of duty, not of feeling, not of loss. There were no operas, no romantic reinterpretations, no literary resurrections as with other royal women who met tragic ends. Anne Boleyn had her librettos. Marie Antoinette had her myths. Empress Elizabeth had her mourning cult. But Maria Isabella had silence. Art did not weep for her. It looked away. Even the church, which had once monitored her soul, her body, her womb, moved on without commemorating her devotion. The chaplains who once visited her bedside in her last years never mentioned her again in sermons. Her name never entered sainthood rumor, martyr legend, or spiritual admiration. She was not controversial enough to be hated, not beloved enough to be missed, not defiant enough to be feared, not dangerous enough to be immortalized. She was simply erased. And perhaps that is the most painful form of loss. Not to be hated, not to be vilified, but to be unspoken. To be gently lifted from the table of memory like a glass that was never filled, and placed back into the cabinet behind a closed door. In modern studies of Bourbon history, her absence is more noticeable than her presence. She is the gap. The unlit window in a row of blazing towers, the quiet room in a palace that never lacked noise. She is the mother of a king, and yet she has no chapter. She is the wife of a ruler, and yet no love letter survives. She was a queen, and yet she does not appear in the imaginations of those who build altars to royalty. Her story had to be pieced together from fragments, from diplomatic notes, from sketches of medical reports, from servants' confessions made decades later, from gaps in records that speak louder than any chronicle, from a sadness that clings to old marble like mold, invisible to the eye but unmistakable to the soul. And in that absence, a question festers. How many queens, how many women, have been buried not just in stone, but in the decision to forget them? There is no record of her voice, no preserved diary, no surviving letters written in her own hand, no reflections on love or loss, no confession of doubt, no mother's lament written at midnight under candlelight. Her words, if they ever existed, were swallowed by time or destroyed by discretion, perhaps burned by ministers who feared fragility, perhaps hidden by descendants who feared shame, or perhaps never written at all because silence had been her only permitted language. Everything we know of Maria Isabella comes through others, through the eyes of men who never truly saw her, through documents penned by diplomats who measured her value in fertility and obedience, through letters from husbands who addressed her not by name, but by title, through reports from priests who counted her sins in whispered confessions, but never counted her grief, through the observations of maids who described what they witnessed, never what she felt. She lived, but never authored her life. She was present, yet never permitted to narrate her own presence. And what is history, if not a story told by those allowed to speak? The few surviving descriptions of her character are filtered, secondhand, cautious. A court official once described her as gentle, though reserved. A Neapolitan midwife recorded that the queen prefers solitude and speaks mostly to the Virgin. An Austrian ambassador, with more poetry than pity, wrote in 1842, "She entered the room like a shadow before dusk, not demanding attention, yet impossible to ignore. Her left eye looked forward, her right looked backward, perhaps to a place where children still lived. But none of these accounts belong to her. They are not her thoughts, her pain, her voice. They are reflections, not truths, echoes, not origin. She was spoken about, examined, catalogued, discussed, but never allowed to speak, never permitted the dignity of self-definition. In every room she entered, she was observed, not as a person, but as a symbol, as a bride, as a breeder, as a queen, as a problem. Never as Maria. Even the rare images of her, brushstrokes frozen in ceremonial oil, tell us little. Her gaze is fixed not on the viewer, but beyond. Her hands are posed with calculated grace, never in motion, never clenched, never trembling. Her mouth, full-lipped and slightly downturned, offers no emotion, only submission. These portraits were not made to reveal her. They were made to present her, an object of state, a representation of order, a decoration for dynastic propaganda. Behind the painted velvet and pearl embroidery, there was a woman who lost 4 children, a woman whose body bore scars no frame could capture, a woman who walked palace halls reciting the names of ghosts. But none of that appears on canvas. None of it was recorded. And so, in the official narrative, it never happened. In this way, she is not unique. She is the archetype of 1,000 royal women whose lives were swallowed whole by the empires they upheld. History remembers their husbands, the kings, the generals, the usurpers. It remembers their sons, the heirs, the tyrants, the revolutionaries. But the mothers? The wives? The ones who suffered so that thrones might stand a little longer? They become fog. Maria Isabella, daughter of Spain, queen of Naples, mother of 12, griever of 4, survivor of nothing, became an outline, a name that floats in the margins. A woman kept alive in footnotes and forgotten in hearts. She lived in a time when speaking too much, especially for a woman, could be seen as arrogance, disruption, danger. And so she remained silent. She survived by being agreeable, invisible, obedient. But obedience has a price, and that price was her voice. Every decision in her life was made by someone else. At 12, her marriage was arranged by her father. At 13, her bed was claimed by her cousin. At 25, her children's education was dictated by councilmen. At 30, her presence was erased from court affairs. At 50, she was spoken of in the past tense while still breathing. Even her death was documented not in her own words, but in the careful language of a court physician who wrote, "Her Majesty passed peacefully after a prolonged decline marked by melancholy and digestive weakness." But the physician never saw her holding her dead daughter's shoes in trembling hands. He never heard her murmur lullabies to cradles that had long since been dismantled. He never stood outside her locked chamber while she whispered the names of children into the dark. He wrote of symptoms, not of sorrow. And thus, her entire life was passed down in the passive voice. She was married. She was crowned. She was pregnant. She was widowed. She was mourned. But who was she? What did she want? What did she fear? What did she dream of when she stared at the same window for hours, watching dust curl in the beams of afternoon light? We will never know, because her story was never allowed to be hers, because she lived inside a structure that needed her to exist, but not to speak, because she was valued for what her body could do, not for what her mind might hold, because history was written by the hands that never held her. And yet, despite that silence, something lingers. Not in archives, not in textbooks, but in the shape of absence. The way her name is missing from tributes, the way her face disappears from portraits after a certain date, the way her children rarely mention her, even when speaking of their own childhoods, the way the palace records taper off, as if embarrassed to acknowledge her quiet decay. She is there, in the spaces between words, in the size of documents, in the blank spaces on pages where her voice might have lived. Maria Isabella lived through others, through their writing, through their judgments, through their erasure, and in doing so she became more than a forgotten queen. She became the symbol of every woman whose life was narrated by men, of every mother remembered only through the deeds of her sons, of every voice that was taught to be beautiful, but not heard. She was 12 when they placed a crown above her head, 12 when they handed her body to her cousin, 12 when she became a queen in name and a ghost in formation, and by the time she was 13, she had already begun to mourn. Maria Isabella gave birth 12 times. She buried 4 of them. She watched 3 grow up with vacant stares, trembling limbs, or words that refused to form. She kissed cold foreheads before they were lowered into velvet caskets. She dressed empty cradles with lace. She folded gowns for girls who would never wear them. She whispered lullabies into air that no longer echoed back. But the world did not allow her to grieve. The court expected composure. The kingdom demanded continuity. The church offered sanctity, but denied sorrow. And so she did what all women taught to serve royalty and silence have done. She buried her grief inside her body. She sewed it between her ribs. She carried it like a second womb, full of things that could not be born. They told her she was strong. They meant she didn't speak. They told her she was noble. They meant she did not scream. They told her she was virtuous. They meant she stayed, even as she slowly disappeared. And by the end, she was neither wife nor queen, neither celebrated nor remembered. She was a woman who had once lived in palaces, now buried beside the children she loved more than the thrones they were supposed to fill. No one carved her grief into stone. No one quoted her words. No one recorded the exact shape of her pain. Because pain without spectacle, pain endured in stillness, is easy to ignore. And yet, Maria Isabella's tragedy was not in her silence alone. It was in the fact that the silence was not hers. It was imposed. It was institutional. It was the silence of dynasties that needed heirs, but not mothers. The silence of courts that required her body, but erased her voice. The silence of men who ruled history and refused to write her name with care. She had no chance to break. She was never allowed to fall apart. Because royal women, especially the quiet ones, were expected to rot without noise. And that, more than madness, more than death, is the most terrifying fate of all. To feel everything and be permitted to show nothing. We often speak of queens in terms of splendor, the jewels they wore, the alliances they secured, the heirs they produced. But how rarely do we speak of what they lost in silence? Maria Isabella was not a ruler. She was not a reformer. She left no wars, no manifestos, no lasting power. And for that, she is easy to forget. But perhaps we should remember her not for what she did, but for what she endured. Because her story is not just her own. It is the story of every woman who was married too young, every girl whose pain was called duty, every mother who was not allowed to grieve because her grief was inconvenient, every voice that was buried before her body. Maria Isabella did not die in battle. She did not fall from grace. She died exactly as they expected her to, quietly. But in her silence, there is a haunting question that lingers still. How many royal women were never mourned simply because they never screamed?